Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping back to a time that's been polished clean by Hollywood and turned into legend. But the real 1870s American frontier wasn't about heroic gunfights at high noon or noble cowboys riding into sunsets. It was about survival in conditions so harsh that most modern people wouldn't last 48 hours. This is the story not of gunslingers and outlaws, but of ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship in a land that killed as often as it gave opportunity. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there falling asleep to these same quiet stories from the past. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's step into a world where every day was a battle just to see tomorrow. The reality of frontier towns. When you imagine a Wild West town, you probably picture wooden sidewalks, swinging saloon doors, and dusty main streets. That part is accurate enough. What the movies don't show you is the overwhelming stench that hits you from 100 yards away. A combination of horse manure, human waste, rotting garbage, and unwashed bodies that creates an almost physical barrier of smell. The typical frontier town in the 1870s is less a community and more a collection of hastily assembled wooden structures clinging to existence in hostile territory. Most buildings are constructed from whatever lumber can be hauled in by wagon or rough cut from local timber. Walls don't quite meet floors. Roofs leak. Windows, if they exist at all, are often just openings covered with oil paper or thin cloth. Glass is expensive and has to be transported carefully across hundreds of miles, so it's a luxury most establishments can't afford. The main street, immortalized in countless films, is usually just a dirt track that turns to boot-sucking mud when it rains and becomes a choking dust storm when it doesn't. There are no storm drains, no sewers, no organized waste management of any kind. Every horse that passes through town drops approximately 50 pounds of manure per day. And in a busy cattle town with hundreds of horses, the accumulation is staggering. Add to this the human waste from chamber pots emptied into the streets. Rotting food scraps, dead animals, and occasionally dead people who haven't been buried yet. And you begin to understand why disease is so rampant. Saloons dominate frontier towns, not because everyone is a drunkard, though alcoholism rates are certainly high, but because they serve as the primary social spaces. They're meeting halls, courtrooms, employment offices, and news sources all rolled into one. A typical saloon is a dim, smoky room with a plank bar, rough tables, and sawdust on the floor to absorb the spit, blood, and vomit that are regular features of an evening's entertainment. The whiskey served in these establishments bears little resemblance to aged bourbon. It's often raw alcohol diluted with water and colored with burnt sugar or tobacco juice. Some barkeeps add more creative ingredients: strychnine for bite, gunpowder for color, or turpentine for extra kick. These additives aren't meant to poison customers. They're meant to create the burning sensation that drinkers associate with strong liquor. Of course, they do occasionally poison customers, but that's considered an acceptable risk. Beer, when available, is warm and often sour. There's no refrigeration, so barrels sit in cellars if the saloon has one, or in the shade if it doesn't, slowly fermenting and developing interesting flavors that have nothing to do with the brewer's intent. Water is added liberally to stretch supplies, creating a weak, yeasty beverage that's consumed less for taste than for its ability to be marginally safer than drinking straight water from the local source. The general store is the other vital establishment in any frontier town. These cramped, dusty buildings stock an astonishing variety of goods, all at astonishing prices. A sack of flour that costs $1 back east might run you $3 or $4 on the frontier. Bacon, beans, coffee, and sugar, the staples of frontier diet, are available but expensive. Fresh vegetables are rare and expensive. Fresh fruit is nearly impossible to find except in late summer and early fall. The proprietor of the general store is often one of the wealthiest people in town, not because his profit margins are enormous, but because he's one of the few people with actual cash flow. He extends credit to local homesteaders and ranchers, keeping careful records of debt in ledgers that sometimes mean the difference between a family keeping their land or losing it. Prostitution is common and largely accepted as an economic reality. Women in the sex trade work out of dedicated brothels in larger towns or out of rooms above saloons in smaller settlements. Their lives are short and brutal. Disease, violence, addiction, and despair kill most before they reach 30. They have no legal protection, minimal social support, and no real path to a different life. Society simultaneously relies on their services and despises them for providing those services. Law enforcement, when it exists, is often a single marshal or sheriff, with perhaps a deputy or two. These men aren't professional police officers in any modern sense. They're whoever was willing to take a dangerous job for minimal pay. Men who are either brave, desperate, foolish, or some combination of all three. They maintain order through a combination of intimidation, personal relationships, and the willingness to use lethal force when necessary. There's no police academy, no training in de-escalation or community relations. You learn by doing, and if you make mistakes, you probably don't live long enough to learn from them. Justice is swift and often arbitrary. Trials, when they happen, are community affairs held in saloons or the open air. Juries are whoever happens to be around and sober enough to follow proceedings. Evidence is whatever people remember or claim to remember. Sentences range from fines to whippings to hanging, with the severity often depending more on the community's mood than the actual crime committed. Daily life and labor. Your typical day on the frontier begins before sunrise. Not because you're an early riser by nature, but because there's no point staying in bed once the sun starts heating your cramped, uncomfortable sleeping space, and the animals begin making noise. Sleep itself is fragmented and unsatisfying. You're sharing quarters with family members, possibly strangers if you're in a boarding house, and the sounds of coughing, snoring, and other bodily functions fill the night. If you're a homesteader, and most frontier residents are, your morning starts with immediate physical labor. There's water to haul from a well or stream that might be a quarter-mile away. In winter, there's ice to break. In summer, the water level drops and you must lower buckets deeper into wells, pulling up bucket after bucket until your arms tremble and your back screams. Fire must be started, a process that's simple only if you've done it 1,000 times before and have decent materials. You need kindling, which must be gathered and kept dry. You need larger wood, which must be chopped, transported, and stacked. If you're on the treeless plains, you might be burning buffalo chips, dried manure that burns but fills your home with an unforgettable smell. Breakfast, if you have one, is basic. Cornmeal mush, maybe bacon if you can afford it. Coffee if you have beans and are willing to use your precious fuel to boil water. The coffee is strong enough to float a horseshoe and bitter enough to make you wince. But it's hot and it contains caffeine, and that's enough to make it valuable. For men working as farm laborers, ranch hands, miners, or in any of the dozens of manual labor jobs that dominate the frontier economy, the next 12 to 16 hours involve back-breaking physical work. Plowing fields behind a team of horses or oxen, a task that leaves every muscle aching. Digging irrigation ditches in hard-packed soil, mending fences that stretch for miles, herding cattle across rough terrain in weather that ranges from freezing to scorching. Cowboys, despite their romantic image in popular culture, live particularly hard lives. A working cowboy earns approximately $30 per month, maybe $40 if he's particularly skilled. For this, he works every day for months at a time, sleeping on the ground, eating beans and salt pork, breathing dust, and dealing with animals that are semi-wild and frequently aggressive. The work destroys bodies. Backs give out from endless time in the saddle. Joints swell from injuries that never properly heal. Teeth rot from poor diet and no dental care. The cattle drives that feature so prominently in Western mythology are genuine tests of endurance. Moving hundreds or thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles requires constant vigilance. You ride all day in sun, rain, or snow. You eat whatever the chuck wagon cook can prepare, usually beans, bacon, and bread. You sleep a few hours before taking your turn at night watch, riding circles around the herd to prevent stampedes. Speaking of stampedes, they're terrifying events where thousands of panicked animals run blindly through the darkness, crushing anything in their path, including cowboys who are caught unaware or whose horses stumble. Mining, whether for gold, silver, copper, or coal, is even more dangerous than ranching. Miners work in dark, cramped tunnels with minimal ventilation and constant risk of collapse. They breathe rock dust and toxic fumes. They use explosives with casual disregard for safety because there are no safety regulations. They develop lung diseases that leave them gasping for breath by their 30s. Cave-ins bury men alive with no possibility of rescue. Underground floods drown crews. Gas explosions turn mines into crematoriums. The promised riches from mining rarely materialize. For every miner who strikes it rich, thousands spend years in brutal labor for minimal returns. The real money in mining towns goes to the people who sell supplies to miners, the shopkeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes who separate miners from their earnings as fast as they can earn them. For the women on the frontier, daily life is an endless round of domestic labor that would break most modern people within days. The romantic notion of frontier women as sun-bonneted figures peacefully churning butter obscures the reality of their experience, which is relentless physical work combined with social isolation and constant danger. A frontier housewife rises even earlier than her husband. She starts the fire, prepares breakfast, feeds chickens, gathers eggs, milks cows if the family has them, and begins the day's endless list of tasks. Laundry, done by hand with harsh soap that destroys skin, can take an entire day for a single family's clothing and linens. Every drop of water must be hauled. Every garment must be scrubbed on a washboard, wrung out by hand and hung to dry, weather permitting. Cooking is a constant task that requires real skill and endless patience. There are no thermometers, no timers, no precise measurements. You learn through experience how to judge when bread dough has risen enough, when meat is cooked through, when preserves have reached the proper consistency. The heat from the stove makes summer cooking unbearable. The need to keep the fire going makes winter exhausting. Sewing and mending never end. Clothes wear out quickly under frontier conditions, and new clothing is expensive. So everything gets patched and repatched until it's more patched than original fabric. Women make all the family's clothing from scratch if possible. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, cutting and stitching garments by hand or with a treadle sewing machine if they're fortunate enough to own one. Garden tending provides essential vegetables for families who otherwise would suffer even worse nutritional deficiencies than they already do. Seeds must be planted, weeds pulled, vegetables harvested and preserved. Canning, pickling, and drying allow families to store food for winter. But these processes require hours of hot, dangerous work over steaming pots and carry the constant risk of botulism if done incorrectly. The isolation that frontier women experience is perhaps their greatest hardship. Many live miles from the nearest neighbor, seeing no other women for weeks or months at a time. They have no one to talk to, no one to share the burden of work, no one to provide emotional support or practical help. The loneliness drives some women to depression so severe that they simply stop functioning. Others develop what contemporaries called prairie madness, a condition that might be clinical depression or might be a reasonable response to impossible circumstances: food, water, and disease. The frontier diet is sufficient to keep most people alive, but catastrophically poor in terms of nutrition. The basic frontier diet consists of what's called the 3 Bs: beans, bacon, and bread. These staples provide calories and some protein, but they're desperately lacking in vitamins, minerals, and nutritional variety. Beans, usually pinto or navy beans, are cheap, store well, and provide protein. They're boiled into a mush and eaten at nearly every meal. After months of this diet, the sight of beans becomes actively depressing, but you eat them anyway because the alternative is hunger. Bacon, meaning salt pork rather than the crispy breakfast meat we know today, is the primary source of fat and flavor in the frontier diet. It's preserved through heavy salting, which makes it last but also makes it incredibly salty. A slab of salt pork might have been cured months ago and carried across half the continent. It's sliced thick and fried, producing the grease used to cook everything else. Bread, when wheat flour is available, is made fresh because there's no way to keep it from going stale or moldy in the frontier climate. More often, bread is made from cornmeal because corn is cheaper and more widely available. Cornbread, corn dodgers, corn mush, variations on the same basic theme of ground corn mixed with water or milk and cooked. Vegetables are seasonal and rare. If you have a garden and it survives the drought, hail, locusts, and other hazards, you might have access to potatoes, turnips, carrots, and cabbage. These are filling but not particularly nutritious when they're your only vegetables for months at a time. Onions and garlic, when available, add flavor and have some antimicrobial properties that probably help more than anyone realizes. Fruit is almost impossible to find. Wild berries can be foraged in some areas during late summer. Apples grow in some climates if you're patient enough to wait for trees to mature. Otherwise, fruit is a distant memory from life back east, or something you hear about in letters from relatives in more settled areas. This dietary monotony leads to widespread vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, is common despite being preventable through fresh fruits and vegetables. Symptoms include bleeding gums, tooth loss, skin lesions, and eventually death. Pellagra, caused by niacin deficiency from a corn-heavy diet, causes skin problems, digestive issues, and dementia. The water situation on the frontier is actively dangerous. Surface water from streams and rivers is often contaminated with animal waste, human waste, and decomposing organic matter. Wells, when properly constructed, can provide cleaner water, but many frontier wells are shallow and poorly maintained, allowing surface contamination to seep in. There's no understanding of waterborne disease in the 1870s. People know that bad water can make you sick, but they don't know why, so they can't effectively prevent it. They rely on folk wisdom that's sometimes helpful, like preferring running water to standing water, and sometimes completely wrong, like believing that whiskey mixed with water purifies it. Cholera is the most feared waterborne disease, and for good reason. Cholera arrives suddenly in frontier communities, spreading through contaminated water sources. Victims develop violent diarrhea and vomiting that leads to severe dehydration. The disease kills quickly, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. During the cholera epidemics of 1849 through 1852, approximately 9 out of 10 people who contract the disease die from it. On the Oregon Trail, some stretches of the route have graves every quarter mile, the majority of them cholera victims. The impact on Native American populations is even more severe. Cholera kills as many as half of the Pawnee people. 2/3 of the Southern Cheyenne die. Among the Comanche, survivors sometimes lack the strength to bury their dead, leaving bodies to decompose where they fell. Arapaho legends speak of people who kill themselves rather than face the dreaded sickness. Typhoid fever, another waterborne disease, kills 10 to 20% of those infected, even with the best available treatment, which on the frontier means rest and hope. Typhoid causes high fever, severe abdominal pain, and in many cases, intestinal perforation that leads to a death so agonizing that morphine, if available, seems like a blessing. Dysentery, bloody flux as it's commonly known, is so common on the frontier that it's almost accepted as a normal condition. It causes severe diarrhea with blood and mucus, leading to dehydration, malnutrition, and often death, particularly in children and the elderly. There's no effective treatment beyond rest and trying to stay hydrated, which is difficult when every drink of water might be reintroducing the bacteria causing the problem. Beyond waterborne diseases, the frontier hosts a terrifying array of other illnesses. Tuberculosis, consumption as it's called, spreads easily in cramped, poorly ventilated living spaces. It causes chronic cough, weight loss, night sweats, and eventually death by drowning as the lungs fill with fluid and blood. There's no cure. Treatment consists of rest, fresh air, and hoping your body fights off the infection, which it usually doesn't. Smallpox outbreaks devastate communities. The disease causes fever, full-body rash, and pus-filled blisters. It kills approximately 30% of those infected and leaves survivors scarred and sometimes blind. Vaccination exists by the 1870s, but access to vaccines on the frontier is spotty at best. Influenza, just the flu as we might think of it today, regularly kills frontier residents who are weakened by malnutrition, exhaustion, and other concurrent illnesses. What would be a miserable week in bed for a healthy, well-nourished person becomes a death sentence for someone living on the edge of survival. Childhood diseases sweep through frontier communities with horrifying regularity. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, scarlet fever, and diphtheria kill children in numbers that are hard for modern people to comprehend. Families expect to lose children. Parents often give the same name to a subsequent child if an earlier child with that name dies. A practice that seems strange until you understand that child mortality is so common that naming practices adapt to accommodate it. Violence, crime, and law. The mythology of Wild West violence focuses on gunfights, bank robberies, and cattle rustling. The reality is both more and less violent than the legends suggest. You're unlikely to witness a high-noon shootout on Main Street, but you're quite likely to be victim of or witness to violence in various other forms. The statistical reality of frontier violence is hotly debated among historians. Some argue that certain mining towns had per capita homicide rates around 116 per 100,000 people, compared to modern American rates of 30 to 40 per 100,000. Others point out that these statistics are misleading because they're based on very small populations where a handful of murders create seemingly enormous rates. What's undeniable is that violence on the frontier is personal, frequent, and often stems from circumstances that seem trivial in retrospect. Men kill each other over card games, perceived insults, and disputes over property boundaries. Alcohol fuels much of this violence, turning arguments into deadly encounters. The weapons available make violence particularly lethal. By the 1870s, revolvers are common and relatively reliable. The Colt Peacemaker, introduced in 1873, becomes the iconic frontier handgun. It's accurate, powerful, and capable of killing a man with a single shot. Rifles are even more deadly. The Winchester repeating rifle, introduced in 1866, holds up to 15 rounds and can be fired quickly and accurately. The problem is that these weapons are carried by men who are often drunk, frequently scared, and sometimes simply violent by nature. There's no training required to own or carry a gun. There are no background checks. In many frontier towns, there aren't even laws against carrying weapons, though some towns do require visitors to check their guns with the local marshal. Gunfights, when they happen, don't resemble Hollywood depictions. They're not formal duels with men facing off at 20 paces. They're sudden, chaotic events where someone pulls a gun and starts shooting, often at close range, often from behind cover or from ambush. The victim frequently doesn't see it coming. The survivor often isn't the person who was morally right or even the better shot, just the person who got lucky or was willing to shoot first. Bank robberies and train robberies, while they do happen, are relatively rare. They require organization, daring, and a certain amount of criminal competence. Most frontier crime is much more mundane. Theft of horses or livestock, burglary of homes and stores, robbery of individuals, fraud in land deals, or business transactions. Horse theft is considered one of the most serious crimes on the frontier. because a horse often represents a man's entire ability to earn a living and transport himself. A man whose horse is stolen might be left stranded miles from help, unable to work, possibly unable to survive. For this reason, horse thieves are often dealt with harshly, sometimes with summary execution by hanging if they're caught by vigilantes, rather than official law enforcement. Vigilante justice is common in areas where official law enforcement is absent or ineffective. A vigilance committee is a group of citizens who take law enforcement into their own hands. Sometimes these committees maintain rough but effective order. Sometimes they become lynch mobs that hang people based on suspicion, rumor, or simply being the wrong race or ethnicity in the wrong place. The legal system, such as it is, provides minimal protection. Trials are often perfunctory affairs. Evidence consists mainly of witness testimony, which can be unreliable or outright fabricated. The accused might not have legal representation. Juries might be composed of men who have already decided on the verdict based on rumor or prejudice. Punishments are harsh. Whipping is common for minor offenses. Branding is used to mark thieves. Hanging is the standard punishment for murder, horse theft, and various other serious crimes. Prisons barely exist on the frontier, so sentences that would involve incarceration back east result in corporal punishment or execution out west. Women have virtually no legal protections against domestic violence. A husband can beat his wife with minimal social consequences and no legal repercussions in most jurisdictions. Women can't easily divorce, can own property in their own names if married, and have no legal right to their own children if they do manage to leave an abusive husband. Sexual assault is common and rarely prosecuted. Women who are assaulted have little recourse. The legal system is unlikely to believe them, particularly if the accused is a prominent citizen. Social stigma often falls on the victim rather than the perpetrator. Women working as prostitutes have essentially no legal protection at all and face routine violence as an accepted hazard of their profession. Violence against racial minorities is endemic and often goes unpunished. Chinese immigrants face organized violence from white workers who view them as economic competition. They're beaten, driven from mining claims, sometimes killed. The Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming in 1885 sees white miners kill at least 28 Chinese workers and drive hundreds more from the town. Mexican Americans, many of whom have lived in the Southwest longer than it's been part of the United States, face violence and legal discrimination designed to separate them from their property. Land grants guaranteed by treaty after the Mexican-American War are often invalidated through legal manipulation or simply ignored. Black Americans who move west hoping to escape Southern oppression find that frontier racism, while different in form, can be equally deadly. They're excluded from economic opportunities, denied service in businesses, and sometimes murdered for violating unspoken racial boundaries. Native Americans, of course, face the most systematic violence. The Indian Wars of the 1870s are essentially campaigns of ethnic cleansing designed to force Native peoples off their traditional lands and onto reservations. Massacre is not an overstatement. At Wounded Knee in 1890, U.S. cavalry kill approximately 300 Lakota, the majority of them women and children. Medicine and medical care on the 1870s frontier is a nightmare from start to finish. Doctors are scarce. Training standards are non-existent. Effective treatments are rare, and most people can't afford professional medical care anyway. When you get sick or injured on the frontier, your most likely outcome is that you either get better on your own or you die. Doctors who practice on the frontier come from varied backgrounds. Some have attended medical school in the East or even in Europe and have legitimate medical training by the standards of the era, which are themselves quite low. Others have simply declared themselves doctors and set up practice with no training whatsoever. There's no licensing system to distinguish between them. A patient has no way of knowing whether their doctor has any idea what he's doing. The medical knowledge of the era is a strange mixture of ancient theory, folk wisdom, an emerging scientific understanding. The germ theory of disease exists, but hasn't been fully accepted by the medical establishment. Many doctors still subscribe to the theory of humors, believing that illness results from imbalances in bodily fluids that must be corrected through bloodletting, purging, or other interventions. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately cutting a patient and draining blood, is still common in the 1870s. Doctors believe that removing bad blood will cure everything from fever to pneumonia. In reality, bloodletting weakens patients who are already ill, making it harder for their bodies to fight infection and recover from illness. Surgery exists, but is extraordinarily dangerous. There's no understanding of antiseptic technique. Surgeons don't wash their hands or sterilize instruments. They operate in regular clothing, often with blood from previous patients still on their coats. The concept that invisible germs could cause infection doesn't guide their practice. As a result, even minor surgical procedures frequently result in deadly infections. Anesthesia is available by the 1870s. Ether and chloroform can render patients unconscious during surgery. However, dosing is imprecise and dangerous. Too little anesthesia, and the patient wakes up mid-surgery, experiencing unimaginable pain. Too much anesthesia, and the patient simply dies on the table. Many frontier doctors don't have access to anesthesia, or don't trust themselves to use it properly. So they perform surgery on conscious patients who are held down by assistants. Amputation is the treatment for severely broken limbs, badly infected wounds, or gangrene. The procedure is brutally simple. The patient is tied down or given whiskey to dull the pain. The limb is cut off with a saw. Blood vessels are tied off, and the wound is bandaged. The patient then either survives or dies from shock, blood loss, or infection. Those who survive face life as amputees in an era with no prosthetics beyond crude peg legs and hook hands. Childbirth on the frontier is particularly terrifying. The maternal mortality rate in the western frontier is 3 times higher than in New England and more than 50 times what it is today. Women die from hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, and various other complications that modern medicine handles routinely. Most frontier women give birth at home, attended by a midwife if one is available, or by a neighbor, or by their husband, or entirely alone. Midwives have varying levels of skill and knowledge. Some are experienced women who have successfully delivered many babies. Others are simply whoever is available when a woman goes into labor. If complications arise during childbirth, there's often nothing anyone can do. A breech presentation means the baby is coming out feet first, which can kill both mother and child. Twins are especially dangerous. Hemorrhaging after delivery can kill a woman in minutes with no way to stop it. Puerperal fever, infection of the uterus after delivery, kills women days after apparently successful births. Even women who survive childbirth face brutal recoveries. In eastern cities, women might rest for a month after giving birth. On the frontier, women are often forced back to their duties within days or even hours. There's no option to rest when there are meals to cook, children to care for, animals to tend. The physical trauma of childbirth, combined with immediate return to hard labor, leads to chronic health problems that plague women for the rest of their lives. Pain relief is limited to alcohol and, for those who can afford it, laudanum or morphine. Both are opiate derivatives and both are highly addictive. Addiction to patent medicines containing opiates is widespread, particularly among women who are given these medicines for menstrual cramps, childbirth pain, or simple exhaustion. There's no understanding that addiction is a medical problem requiring treatment. Addicts are simply viewed as morally weak. Patent medicines, tonics, and cure-alls sold through traveling salesmen and general stores promise miracle cures for every ailment imaginable. Most contain alcohol, often in very high percentages. Many contain opiates. Some contain mercury, cocaine, or other substances that are actively harmful. They don't cure anything, but they do make people feel better temporarily through intoxication or drugging, which is enough to keep customers buying. Dentistry is primitive and agonizing. Toothaches are common due to poor diet, lack of dental hygiene, and the grinding wear of eating bread that often contains actual stones from the grinding mill. The treatment for a bad tooth is extraction, performed by whoever is willing to do it, possibly a doctor, possibly a blacksmith, with pliers and no anesthetic beyond whiskey. Broken bones are set without x-rays, meaning the doctor has to guess at proper alignment. If the bones heal at an angle, or if bone fragments are left inside, the patient lives with chronic pain and disability. If infection sets in, the limb might have to be amputated. For most frontier residents, medical care consists of home remedies passed down through families or learned from neighbors. Some of these remedies are harmless and possibly helpful. Honey for wounds, willow bark tea for pain, chamomile for digestion. Others are useless. Poultices made from bread or mud. Some are actively harmful. Mercury for syphilis, lead for skin conditions. The lack of medical care means that minor injuries and illnesses become life-threatening conditions. A simple cut that gets infected can kill you. A case of diarrhea that would be unpleasant but manageable can dehydrate you to death. A broken arm that's not properly set leaves you with a permanent disability in an environment where you need full use of both arms to survive. Winter. The silent killer winter on the frontier is when the harsh conditions that characterize frontier life intensify into something genuinely life-threatening. The romantic image of a cozy log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney obscures the grim reality. Winter is when the frontier kills people who manage to survive the rest of the year. The first challenge is simply staying warm. Heating a frontier home requires massive amounts of fuel. A family might need several cords of wood to get through a single winter, each cord representing a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. This wood must be cut, split, hauled, and stacked before the first snow falls. If you live on the treeless plains, you're burning buffalo chips or twisted hay, both of which produce less heat than wood and require constant tending to keep a fire going. The homes themselves provide minimal protection from cold. A typical homesteader's cabin or sod house has walls that are poorly insulated. Chinking between logs or sod bricks doesn't fully seal gaps. Windows, if they exist, are just openings with shutters or oil paper coverings that do little to block wind. The roof leaks cold air almost as effectively as it leaks rain. Inside these homes, temperatures drop to barely above freezing, even with a fire going. You sleep huddled under every blanket and quilt the family owns, often sharing body heat with siblings or other family members. You wake to find frost on the inside of the walls and ice in the water bucket. Your first task each morning is reviving the fire, a process that requires getting out from under the covers and working with frozen, fumbling fingers to coax flames from banked coals. Food becomes scarce in winter. The garden is dead. Hunting is difficult in deep snow. Fish are locked under ice. Stored food from fall harvest is all you have, and it has to last until spring. Families ration carefully, knowing that running out of food in February means months of hunger before anything grows again. The monotony of the winter diet grinds at mental health as much as physical health. Dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, maybe some dried vegetables or canned goods. The same meals day after day, week after week. Vitamin deficiencies worsen. Energy levels drop. Teeth loosen in gums. Old injuries ache in the cold. Blizzards are genuine terrors. A blizzard on the plains can last for days, with wind-driven snow creating whiteout conditions where you can't see your hand in front of your face. During these storms, you absolutely cannot leave your shelter. Stories abound of men who stepped outside during blizzards to tend livestock and became disoriented within feet of their door, wandering lost until they froze to death within yards of safety. The famous schoolhouse blizzard of 1888 catches children and teachers in one-room schoolhouses across the Plains states. Many of the children, dismissed from school as the storm approaches, never make it home. They freeze to death, trying to walk distances they've walked hundreds of times before, but can't navigate in blinding snow. Official counts list 235 dead, But the real number is almost certainly higher. Livestock require care, even in the worst weather. Cows need milking, horses need feeding, chickens need tending. This means that someone has to brave the cold every day, sometimes multiple times per day, to walk to the barn or the lean-to where animals shelter. These trips are short but brutal, and they're non-negotiable. If you don't milk the cow, she suffers and her production will drop. If you don't water the horses, they'll die. If you don't gather the eggs, they'll freeze and burst. The risk of frostbite and hypothermia is constant. Frostbite strikes exposed skin first: fingers, toes, ears, nose. The frozen tissue might recover, or it might die and eventually fall off, leaving stumps and scars. Severe frostbite can necessitate amputation without anesthesia in a frontier cabin with minimal medical supplies. Hypothermia kills more slowly, but just as certainly. As your body temperature drops, you become confused and clumsy. Your judgment deteriorates. You might feel warm even as you're freezing to death. You might make decisions that kill you, like taking off clothing or lying down in the snow to rest. Hypothermia victims are sometimes found partially undressed, having removed their coats in the final stages of freezing, their cold-addled brains convinced they were overheating. The psychological toll of a frontier winter is immense. Imagine being trapped in a small, dark, cold space with the same people for months on end. No entertainment beyond what you can create yourself. No privacy. No escape. The sun rises late and sets early. The world outside is white and dead and hostile. Cabin fever, the psychological distress caused by prolonged isolation and confinement, is a real phenomenon. People become irritable, depressed, even violent. Families that love each other in summer might barely tolerate each other by March. Some people break entirely, walking out into winter storms rather than spend another day trapped inside. Spring, when it finally comes, arrives slowly and grudgingly. Snow melts to reveal the losses of winter. Livestock that didn't survive. Structural damage to buildings. Sometimes human bodies that were buried by drifts and couldn't be retrieved. The mud season that follows makes travel nearly impossible as frozen ground thaws into a morass that sucks at wheels and boots. The economic trap. The frontier is sold to prospective settlers as a land of opportunity where hard work leads to prosperity. The Homestead Act of 1862 promises 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to live on it and improve it for 5 years. This sounds generous until you understand what it actually means. First, the land isn't truly free. You pay a filing fee, usually around $10, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that many people moving west have almost nothing. Then you must prove up the claim, meaning you must build a dwelling, cultivate a certain amount of land, and live there for 5 years. During those 5 years, you still owe taxes on the land. The land itself, while technically free, is often not good land. The best land was claimed years ago. What's left is arid, rocky, located far from water sources, or otherwise marginal. The promise that rain follows the plow, the belief that farming will somehow change the climate to make arid land moist, is believed by many but is complete nonsense. Everything else costs money: tools, seeds, livestock, building materials, food until your first harvest. Most homesteaders arrive with minimal capital and immediately go into debt-buying necessities. The general store extends credit at high interest rates. By the time you harvest your first crop, you're already deeply in debt. The weather and climate make farming incredibly difficult. Droughts can last for years, turning fields to dust. Hailstorms can destroy an entire season's crop in minutes. Locusts can strip fields bare, leaving nothing but bare stalks. Early frosts can kill crops before they mature. Late spring snows can bury newly planted seeds. The locust plagues of the 1870s are biblical in their devastation. Swarms of grasshoppers darken the sky, landing in numbers so thick they cover the ground in a seething mass. They eat everything: crops, grass, even the wooden handles of tools, and the clothing hanging on lines. A farmer can watch an entire season's work disappear in hours while being unable to do anything except listen to the sound of millions of insects chewing. Even when harvests succeed, getting crops to market is prohibitively expensive. Railroads charge exorbitant rates for freight. They charge farmers more to ship grain a short distance than they charge large companies to ship goods hundreds of miles. This pricing is deliberate. The railroads know farmers have no alternative and milk them for every penny. The boom and bust cycle of frontier agriculture is brutal. A few good years encourage farmers to expand, taking on debt to buy more land or equipment. Then a drought year wipes out crops, and farmers can't repay their loans. Banks foreclose, taking land and everything on it. Families that have worked for years to build a homestead lose everything and are left homeless and destitute. For those who work for wages rather than trying to homestead, the economics are equally harsh. A cowboy earning $30 per month might think he's building wealth until he realizes that a new pair of boots costs $5 and wears out in a few months of hard use. A town laborer earning similar wages spends most of it on food and lodging, saving almost nothing. Women have even fewer economic opportunities. Those who work as seamstresses, laundresses, cooks, or domestic servants earn a fraction of what men earn for equally hard work. Unmarried women have almost no socially acceptable ways to support themselves. Marriage is often an economic necessity rather than a choice based on affection. The dream of striking it rich through mining is exactly that, a dream. The famous gold rushes create a few millionaires and thousands of disappointed prospectors. The odds of finding significant gold deposits are infinitesimally small. The reality is backbreaking labor in streams and gulches, living in tents or crude shacks, eating terrible food, and finding just enough gold dust to keep hoping for more. When major deposits are found, individual prospectors rarely benefit. Mining companies with capital and equipment move in, buying out or simply taking over claims. The prospectors who do the actual discovering and early mining sell out for far less than the claims are worth or get pushed out through legal manipulation or outright fraud. The economic system is designed to extract wealth from frontier workers and channel it to banks, railroad companies, and other large enterprises back east. Frontier residents work themselves into early graves to make other people rich while barely scraping by themselves. Travel and transportation. Moving around on the frontier is an ordeal that modern people, accustomed to hopping in cars or onto planes, can barely imagine. Distance on the frontier is measured not in miles, but in days or weeks of travel, and every journey carries significant risk. The most common form of long-distance travel is the covered wagon, romanticized in countless stories, but actually a miserable way to spend weeks or months. These wagons, often called prairie schooners, are not comfortable. They're essentially wooden boxes on wheels, covered with canvas that provides minimal protection from weather. The wagons are cramped and stuffy. Families pack everything they own into a space about 4 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet long. There's barely room to sit, let alone lie down comfortably. Despite what you see in movies, people don't ride in the wagons except when sick or injured. The weight of passengers plus cargo would exhaust the oxen or horses pulling the wagon. Instead, you walk. For weeks or months, you walk alongside the wagon from dawn until dusk, covering perhaps 15 miles on a good day, sometimes less if the terrain is difficult. The pace is grinding and monotonous. Walk. Stop to rest the animals. Walk some more. The dust kicked up by the wagons ahead of you gets into your eyes, your nose, your lungs. Your feet blister and bleed through worn shoes or boots. Your joints ache from the endless walking. The sun beats down without mercy. Rain soaks you to the skin because the canvas cover protects the cargo, not the people walking beside the wagon. River crossings are genuinely dangerous. Many rivers on the westward trails are too deep to ford safely. Wagon trains must choose between expensive ferry services when available or attempting to float their wagons across. Drowning is a common cause of death on the Oregon and California trails. Families watch helplessly as wagons tip over in strong currents, dumping precious supplies and sometimes people into rivers that sweep them away. The trails themselves are marked not by signs, but by the ruts worn by thousands of previous wagons and by landmarks. Rock formations, river crossings, mountain passes. Getting lost is a real possibility, especially if you're traveling outside the main wagon train season. Some trails are marked by more grim landmarks, the graves of those who died along the way. On some stretches of the Oregon Trail, travelers report seeing graves every quarter mile. Accidents are frequent. Wagon wheels break on rocks. Axles crack. Animals pull up lame. People, especially children, fall under wagon wheels and are crushed. Guns accidentally discharge. Snake bites, particularly from rattlesnakes, kill or seriously injure people. Lightning strikes wagons or the trees people shelter under during storms. Disease spreads through wagon trains with devastating efficiency. Cholera is the biggest killer, but typhoid, dysentery, measles, and smallpox also sweep through groups of travelers. When someone dies, the wagon train usually can't stop long enough for a proper funeral. Bodies are buried in shallow graves beside the trail, sometimes without even basic markers. Native American attacks, while they do happen, are far less common than Hollywood suggests. The vast majority of wagon train travelers never encounter hostile native peoples. When conflicts do occur, they're often the result of misunderstandings, theft of livestock, or revenge for previous wrongs, rather than unprovoked attacks on innocents. For those traveling shorter distances within already settled frontier areas, horseback is the primary option. But riding a horse for hours or days is not the pleasant experience depicted in films. Unless you're accustomed to it, riding makes you desperately sore. Your thighs and backside develop bruises and saddle sores. Your spine jars with every step the horse takes. In hot weather, you're sweating profusely, and the leather saddle creates painful chafing. In cold weather, your hands go numb on the reins and your face freezes. Horses require constant care. They need to be fed, watered, and rested regularly. A horse ridden hard without adequate care will sicken or die, leaving you stranded. Horse theft is common, and a man without a horse in frontier country faces serious hardship. You can't work most jobs without a horse. You can't travel significant distances. In an emergency, you can't escape danger. Stagecoaches provide somewhat faster travel on established routes, but they're expensive, uncomfortable, and dangerous. The coaches are cramped boxes on wheels, bouncing violently over rough roads. You're packed in with other passengers, enduring their body odor and potentially their diseases for days. The coaches travel day and night, stopping only to change horses at relay stations. You try to sleep sitting up while being thrown around like a rag doll. Stagecoach robberies are a real threat. Bandits target coaches because they often carry strong boxes full of cash or gold being shipped between towns. Passengers are robbed of their valuables and sometimes shot if they resist or if the robbers are particularly violent. The remote locations of many robberies mean there's no help nearby and minimal chance of the robbers being caught. The railroad, when it becomes available in the 1860s and 1870s, revolutionizes travel but isn't accessible to everyone. Railroad tickets are expensive. A cross-country journey might cost $65 or more, far beyond the means of many frontier residents. The trains themselves are crowded, dirty, and uncomfortable for those traveling in standard class. The wealthy travel in relative comfort in sleeping cars and dining cars. Everyone else sits on hard benches in cars that are freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. Even with the railroad, you still face the last miles problem. The railroad goes only where tracks have been laid. To reach your actual destination, you usually need to take a stagecoach or wagon from the nearest rail station, adding days of additional uncomfortable travel to your journey. Local travel within a town or between nearby homesteads is usually done on foot or horseback. Roads, in the generous sense of the term, are just wagon ruts through dirt. When it rains, they become mud trenches that can swallow a wagon wheel. When it doesn't rain, they're bone-jarring expanses of rocks and ruts that make every journey an endurance test. In winter, travel becomes exponentially more difficult. Snow buries trails. Temperatures drop to levels that can kill exposed travelers in hours. Getting caught in a blizzard while traveling between towns or homesteads is often fatal. People freeze to death within sight of their destinations, disoriented by whiteout conditions and unable to find shelter. The isolation created by difficult travel has profound impacts on frontier life. Medical emergencies can't be quickly addressed because the doctor is a day's ride away. Women in labor can't summon a midwife who lives on the next homestead over if a storm has made travel impossible. Children can't attend school when it's too far to walk in harsh weather. Social connections fray when visiting someone requires a full day's journey each way. Mail service exists, but is slow and unreliable on the frontier. A letter sent from the East Coast might take weeks or months to reach a frontier address. Return correspondence takes equally long. Families separated by the westward migration might go months between letters, never knowing if their relatives are alive or dead until the next post arrives. The Pony Express, famous in frontier mythology, operates for only 18 months before being replaced by the telegraph. During its brief existence, it provides faster mail delivery, about 10 days from Missouri to California, but it's expensive. Sending a letter costs $5 per half ounce, far beyond what most people can afford for routine correspondence. Telegraph lines, when they're strung, allow instantaneous communication over long distances, but only for those who live near a telegraph office and can afford to pay for messages. Most frontier homesteaders never send or receive a telegram. For them, communication with the outside world remains limited to infrequent mail and whatever news travelers bring. The isolation and difficulty of travel create a kind of psychological distance that's hard for modern people to understand. People on the frontier are not just physically distant from friends and family back east. They're temporally distant as well. By the time news reaches them, events are weeks or months old. By the time they respond, more weeks pass. They live in a delayed, fragmented connection with the rest of the world. The reality of homesteading, building a homestead from raw land, is not the noble pioneering venture depicted in sanitized histories. It's an overwhelming task that defeats more people than it elevates, leaving broken families and abandoned dreams scattered across the plains. Your 160 acres of homestead land is virgin prairie or desert when you arrive. There are no cleared fields, no buildings, no well, no fences. There is, in most cases, no water source on the property. You must create everything from scratch, using minimal tools and whatever materials you can gather or afford to buy. The first priority is shelter. On the treeless plains where most homestead land is located, you can't build a log cabin because there are no logs. Instead, you build a soddy, a house made from blocks of grass-bound earth cut from the prairie itself. You use a special plow to cut strips of sod, then chop these strips into blocks roughly 3 feet long and 6 inches thick. These blocks, heavy and awkward to handle, are stacked like bricks to form walls. A typical soddy is small, perhaps 12 by 14 feet for a family of 4 or more. The walls are thick, sometimes 2 feet or more, which provides good insulation but makes the interior dark. Windows are small or non-existent because glass is expensive and cutting large openings in sod walls weakens the structure. The roof is made from whatever you can find. More sod laid over wooden poles or boards if you can afford them, though boards often warp and leak. Living in a soddy is an exercise in discomfort and disgust. The walls provide homes for insects, mice, and snakes. During rain, the roof leaks brown, muddy water that drips for days after the storm ends. Snakes sometimes fall from the ceiling where they've been living in the sod. The floor is dirt, which turns to mud when the roof leaks. In dry weather, the sod walls shed a constant fine rain of dirt. coating everything in grit. The structure is dark, damp, and musty smelling. Mold grows in the perpetually moist sod. The air inside is heavy and stale. In summer, soddies stay cooler than the outside air, which is pleasant, but they're also humid and stuffy. In winter, they're cold despite the thick walls, and condensation from your breath freezes on the interior walls. Once you have shelter, you must create a water source. If you're lucky, there's a stream or spring on or near your property. More likely, you must dig a well. This means excavating by hand through soil and rock until you reach the water table, which might be 20, 50, or 100 feet down. It's dangerous, back-breaking work. Cave-ins bury diggers alive. Bad air in deep wells suffocates workers. Many homesteaders hire professional well diggers if they can afford it, but this means going into debt before you've planted a single seed. Breaking the prairie sod to create fields is another Herculean task. The thick prairie sod, bound together by deep grass roots, resists ordinary plows. You need a breaking plow, a massive, heavy implement pulled by multiple oxen or horses. The work is exhausting for both animals and humans. You might break an acre or two per day, walking behind the plow from dawn until dark, breathing dust, enduring sun or cold, wrestling with the heavy equipment. The first year, you can't plant normal crops because the newly broken sod hasn't decomposed enough. You must plant crops that will grow in rough soil. Sod corn pushed directly into the torn earth, or potatoes planted in the upturned sod. Your first harvest, if there is one, barely feeds your family through the first winter. Fencing your property to keep livestock in and neighboring livestock out requires posts and wire, both of which cost money you probably don't have. You might try building fences from hedges, planting thorny bushes in rows, but these take years to grow and don't provide immediate protection. In the meantime, livestock wander freely, eating crops, causing disputes with neighbors. Water for irrigation, essential in the arid plains climate, is difficult and expensive to provide. Some homesteaders attempt to dig irrigation ditches, carrying water from distant sources. Others try to drill wells specifically for irrigation. Most simply hope for rain and watch their crops die during the frequent droughts. Your first livestock, if you can afford any, are probably chickens. They're cheap, relatively easy to care for, and provide eggs. Gradually, you might acquire a cow for milk, pigs for meat, perhaps a team of oxen or horses for field work. Each animal requires shelter, food, and care. When drought strikes or winter feed runs short, you watch your livestock weaken and die, losing your investment and your future productivity. The isolation of homestead life wears on everyone, but especially on women and children. Homesteads are often miles from the nearest neighbor. Days or weeks might pass without seeing another human being outside your immediate family. Children grow up without playmates. Women have no social interaction beyond their husbands and children. The loneliness is crushing. Prairie fires are a constant terror. A fire started by lightning or by carelessness miles away can race across the dry grass at terrifying speed, driven by wind. You have minimal warning and minimal ability to fight it. If the fire is large and wind-driven, your only option might be to flee, abandoning everything. Some homesteaders plow fire breaks around their property, strips of bare earth that fires theoretically can't cross. But wind can carry burning embers across these gaps. Tornadoes appear with little warning on the plains, black funnels dropping from storm clouds. The violence of a tornado is beyond comprehension to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The wind can lift your soddy and scatter it across the prairie, throw your wagon hundreds of feet, drive straw through tree trunks like nails through wood. Root cellars, holes dug into the earth and covered with doors, provide the only real protection if you have time to reach them. Many homesteaders fail within the first 5 years. They run out of money, lose crops to drought or insects, lose family members to disease, or simply give up in the face of relentless hardship. They abandon their claims, walking away from years of work, and return east as failures or move on to new attempts in new territories. Those who succeed and prove up their claims after 5 years gain ownership of their 160 acres. But this doesn't mean they've achieved prosperity. They've gained ownership of marginal land that requires constant backbreaking labor to make productive. They've aged 20 years in 5. They've often lost children, health, or hope along the way. But they've survived, and in the context of the frontier, survival itself is a form of success. The final truth. So here you are, transported back to the 1870s American frontier. You've survived exactly 1 day, which makes you luckier than many. You've drunk contaminated water and might already be incubating cholera. You've eaten a nutritionally catastrophic diet. You've breathed air thick with manure dust and coal smoke. You've worked until your back screams and your hands bleed. And tomorrow, if you survive the night, you'll do it all again. Because this is the reality the mythology erases. The frontier isn't about individual freedom or manifest destiny or taming the wilderness. It's about survival in conditions designed to break you. It's about ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship because they have no other choice or because they believe the promises about land and opportunity and discovered too late that those promises were at best incomplete and at worst outright lies. The men and women who lived through this era weren't superhuman. They were people like you, thrust into circumstances where every day was a battle between staying alive and giving up. Many of them lost that battle. The cemeteries scattered across the frontier contain rows of graves, many marked only with weathered wooden crosses or rough stones. The names long since worn away by wind and weather. Children's graves are heartbreakingly common. Tiny markers commemorating lives that lasted months or a few short years. The ones who survived did so through a combination of luck, stubbornness, and the ability to endure things that would hospitalize modern people. They learned to live with chronic pain, with hunger, with fear. They learned to watch loved ones die and keep working because the livestock still needed tending and the crops still needed harvesting. They learned to smile and call it a good year when they merely didn't lose ground instead of moving forward. We remember the frontier as a time of heroes and adventure because that's a better story than the truth. It was a time of cholera and starvation, of women dying in childbirth and children's graves, of casual violence and systematic oppression, of dreams that died as quickly as the bodies buried in unmarked prairie graves. It was a time when the powerful exploited the powerless, when railroad companies and banks grew rich while the people who actually worked the land struggled to survive. The frontier killed people not just through disease and violence, but through the slow, grinding pressure of impossible conditions. It killed them with isolation and loneliness, with endless labor for minimal return, with the knowledge that no matter how hard they worked, they might lose everything to drought or locusts or simple bad luck. It killed their hope before it killed their bodies, leaving them to shuffle through years or decades as hollowed-out versions of the people who had arrived full of dreams about new beginnings. And yet we still tell the frontier story as though it were something glorious, something to admire and emulate. We package it into 2-hour movies where the heroes are clean and well-fed, where violence is dramatic rather than squalid, where women exist primarily to be rescued or to provide motivation for male characters, where Native Americans are either noble savages or faceless threats, where the Chinese workers who built the railroads and the Mexican Americans who ranched the Southwest for generations, before it was called the West, don't appear at all. The real frontier was dirty and painful and fair. It was people dying of preventable diseases, children going hungry, women aging decades and years under the burden of endless labor. It was casual cruelty, accepted as normal because everyone was too tired and too scared to fight against it. It was exploitation dressed up in the language of opportunity, extraction masked as development, conquest presented as destiny. So the next time you watch a Western or hear someone talk about the good old days, remember this. You wouldn't have survived a day in the Wild West. Neither would most people. The cholera would get you, or the typhoid, or the infected cut that turned to blood poisoning. or the childbirth, or the mining accident, or the winter cold, or simply the grinding exhaustion of trying to farm land that was never meant to be farmed with tools that barely worked, while eating food that barely nourished you. And the fact that anyone survived at all, that people endured these impossible conditions and carved out lives and raised families and built communities, is perhaps the real story worth telling. Not because the frontier was good or right or just, but because the human capacity for endurance in the face of suffering is itself remarkable, even when that suffering was unnecessary and preventable and created by systems designed to benefit those who never had to experience it. The frontier teaches us not that those times were better, but that these times are incomparably superior. Every time you turn on a tap and clean water flows out, you're experiencing something frontier residents would have considered magic. Every time you flip a switch and light floods a room, you're using technology that would have seemed impossible. Every time you recover from an infection that would have killed your great-grandparents, you're benefiting from medical knowledge purchased with countless lives. We shouldn't romanticize the past. We should remember it accurately, with all its horror and hardship, so we can appreciate how fortunate we are and commit to never going back to those conditions. The frontier wasn't glorious. It was brutal, and we're all better off for having left it behind. Now rest. You're safe and warm and comfortable. The water from your tap won't give you cholera. Your food is safe and nutritious. Your home is secure. Your medical care, if you need it, is effective and based on actual science rather than bloodletting and hope. You're living in conditions that frontier residents would have considered impossible luxury, the kind of comfort they could barely imagine even in their wildest dreams of a better future. And if you enjoyed this journey into the harsh reality of the past, go ahead and subscribe. But only if learning about how difficult life used to be helps you appreciate how fortunate we are now, how much progress we've made, how many people suffered and died to create the world we now take for granted. Sleep well. The frontier is far behind us, and we should all be grateful for that. Rest in the knowledge that tomorrow you won't wake to haul water from a contaminated well, won't spend 16 hours plowing hard ground behind stubborn oxen, won't watch helplessly as disease takes someone you love. Tomorrow will be another comfortable day in a comfortable world, and that's not something to take lightly. That comfort was built on the backs of people who never got to experience it themselves. And honoring their memory means acknowledging both their suffering and our obligation to never let conditions deteriorate back to what they endured. Good night.